We have four panelists. The rules of the game are they'll each have 8 to 10 minutes where they'll each make an initial statement, some with slides, some not with slides. Then will be a little bit of riffing off each other, and then as quickly as we can, we'll open it up to the audience. We've got an hour, so there should be at least 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion towards the end. So let me first of all just tell you who you've got here, because I don't think it's in any of the programs we've got. At the far end, we've got John Perry. He's a Henry Waldgrave Stuart Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Stanford. He's a founding co-director of CSLI, which is the institution that brought me over to Stanford way back in 1987. He's made significant contributions to philosophy in the fields of logic, philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of mind. He's known, and by me loved, for his work on situation semantics, together with our late colleague John Barwise, on work on reflexivity, indexicality, personal identity, and self-knowledge. He's authored several books, including most recently, Reference and Reflexivity. Not in the same order, because I'll get lost with four things if I go in a different order. Sitting next to me here, we've got Pat Langley, I've also known for many years, serves as director of the Institute for the Study of Learning and Expertise, and as honorary professor of computer science at the University of Auckland, that's in New Zealand. He has contributed to artificial intelligence and cognitive science for more than 35 years, has published over 200 papers and 5 books on these topics. Professor Langley has developed some of the earliest computational approaches to scientific knowledge discovery. I first knew him as a co-author of one of the books I read early on in my career. He was an early champion of both experimental studies of machine learning and its application to real-world problems. Emma Brunskill, who I met just a few minutes ago, although I'm in typical Stanford fashion, I'm already engaged in a research study with one of her PhD students. Emma Brunskill is an assistant professor of computer science here at Stanford. Her lab works to advance the foundations of reinforcement learning and artificial intelligence, with a particular focus on the technical challenges that arise when we construct interactive systems that amplify human potential. She's received multiple national awards for outstanding work as a young faculty member, and her group has received numerous best paper nominations for their research. And she lowers the average age of the audience dramatically, which is very, very nice. Okay. And finally, we've got John Willinsky. He's the Khosla Family Professor of Education at Stanford's Graduate School of Education and Professor of Publishing Studies, SFU, and Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the SFU Library. John started the Public Knowledge Project in 1998 at the University of British Columbia in an effort to create public and global access to research and scholarship through the use of new publishing technologies. Some of his current research interests are in scholarly communication, sociology of knowledge, and technology and literacy. And let me just begin the thing by reminding everybody what the title of the session is, and we'll see if we can keep close to what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about human learning after machine learning. So John, I think I'll start with you at the far end. As the philosopher, can you at least explain to us, the mathematician part of me wants a definition. What do we mean by learning? Because it might not mean the same for people as it does for machines. So your 10 minutes of fame are about to begin, John.
You said I have 80 minutes?
10. 8 to 10.
8 to 10. Oh,
it's an English 80. Accent. It gets them all.
I've got an 80 minutes.
Yeah, that's the English accent, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Keith. I'm really happy to be here. One of the most exciting things in my 50 years at Stanford has been my association on the peripheries, to be sure, of AI, which, of course, is the most exciting thing that's happened intellectually in the world in the last 50 years. Learning. Well, let's start with intelligence. What's intelligence? I think I know what intelligence is. Intelligence is when you have the ability to pick a system has the ability to pick up information and is wired up or whatever so that that information causes action that produces a good result given the information. That's what intelligence is. That's a pretty wide-ranging notion of intelligence. For example, a mousetrap comes out intelligent on this basis. A little pedal picks up the information in the circumstances, if you've put it in the right place, next to the refrigerator, not in the middle of the living room floor. Probability is that there's a mouse there. If it wiggles, then it automatically releases the spring, which automatically releases the hammer. That's what those of us in the philosophy of mousetraps call that thing, which kills the mouse, which is a good result. Good result for who? Well, in this case, the person who bought the mousetrap. They set the value. When you apply this to evolution, of course, then you say, well, Mother Nature sets the value. But that's a metaphor. So you have a philosophical problem right at the beginning. To see that something is a case of harnessing information and intelligence, you have to solve an equation or a formula with 3 variables, right? What information are they getting? What's the causal connection to the action? What's the action? And what value does the action promote? Learning is the ability to change the level of intelligence, which can affect any one of the 3. You may learn to get new information. You may develop new automatic connections, like when you develop a skill at hitting tennis. I've heard that people do that. I never could. Or when you get a new value, right? Like, well, anyway. You'll stop me, right?
Well, I can stop you. Well, I can try.
You could try. A little bit about AI and philosophy. When I came here, the only thing I knew about AI was something that I'd read at UCLA, which is where I was before, by Yeshua Bar Hillel, written in the late 40s, said, well, the problem with learning language from an artificial system is brought out by the sentence, put the baby in the pen. A lot of you have heard of that. Human immediately says, playpen. But how does a human know playpen, not fountain pen or penitentiary or pig pen? Common sense. Computers don't have common sense. End of story. Well, that satisfied me. Then I got to Stanford. I met John McCarthy. I met Pat Langley. I met these really bright people who were doing all kinds of exciting things. And Barweiss and I really appreciated John McCarthy's letting us use his computer, which had very innovative things, like email. I don't know what we called it then, DARPA-driven email. So I'd wake up in the morning, I'd have 2 or 3 messages from a couple of people. Now I wake up, I have about 300 messages, about 100 of them from various forms of the Democratic Party, and so forth and so on. But I digress. So it went through, the first stage was philosophy is obviously a major irritation to Pat and John. I mean, because you know, every month or so, McCarthy would have to fight down some philosopher that was proving that AI was impossible or stupid or immoral. We actually put out a book at CSLI Publications with his reviews of you know, everything from John Searle to Heidegger. I mean, actually, I'm not sure which. Then there was a golden era, because we found that AI people really wanted to understand natural language. And we looked at the Bar Hillel principle, and everybody agreed, well, the way to do that is to understand how humans understand natural language. And who knows about that? Well, linguists, but maybe even some philosophers. So we founded CSLI to work on that. We hired this guy. And we had money for the first time in any philosopher's life. That lasted from about 1983 to about 1993, I guess. I made about 15 trips to Japan, talked to AI people. It was amazing telling them what the latest philosophical and linguistic ideas at CSLI were. But then the paradigm shifted. Suddenly it occurred to someone that, hey, we've got gobs of memory. We've got gobs of corpora online. We've got Bayes' theorem. Why do we need philosophy or linguistics? I'm exaggerating slightly. The money disappeared. I still have an office over there, even though I'm emeritus. And most of the linguists deserted the ship and became computational linguists. But now things are brightening up again because AI's gotten so good that you're worried about creating persons, singularity. And if you create persons, you're going to need philosophers to tell you whether to create them or not. Person has personal identity, person has consciousness. I happen to be an expert on both in the philosophical sense, which means I can tell you what's wrong with what other people say, and nobody agrees with what I say. But my personal preference was don't create persons. Create things that will make persons more likely to be data-driven. My image is the following. Lately, with the hurricanes, you watch CNN or MSNBC or even Fox, and you get computer-driven models of what the hurricanes are going to do. They're not all the same. There's the British one and there's the American one. They differ somehow. And people take that seriously. Well, there should be computer-driven models of everything that comes up. I'm tired of watching people at CNN and MSNBC interview the same people. Why don't they interview a computer that has a whole effing history of the world available to it? If we'd had that, we wouldn't have had World War I. You know, the Kaiser or the king would have said, what's going to happen if we go to war? And the computer said, bump, bump, bump. Holy shit, that's a bad idea. We should have that now. We can't get the president to listen to it, the current one. But if we got in the habit of seeing people use what we've got available to answer questions, you don't have to ask somebody that nobody believes because they're a human being and because they're either a Democrat or they're not a Democrat. Just ask a computer, what happens if we pass this budget? Blip, blip, you go broke. People would start stress. So that's my message for AI. Come back to one last point to kind of close things around. Judge Scalia, who claimed to have great understanding of natural language, at a very important decision on the Eighth Amendment, said that the Eighth Amendment, you probably all know, it says excessive fines and bail shall not be required, and cruel and unusual punishments shall not be administered. And he had given us a bunch of erudite arguments, saying that the punishment clause wasn't talking about proportional punishment. The case involved somebody who had about a pound of cocaine and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He said, well, people say that's disproportionate punishment, but the sense of punishment in the Constitution has no sense of proportion. This is complete bull, but that's what he said. But then he says, and if that doesn't convince you, well, suppose it is out of proportion, and suppose that is relevant. But the amendment says it has to be both cruel and unusual. He doesn't know English. It's amazing. A lot of people, you say that to them, and they say, well, that seems right. Well, it doesn't seem right. And he probably wouldn't have needed a sophisticated computer, although I think the Supreme Court and everybody else ought to be required to have one anytime they make any statement about English usage. We're so good at, not thanks to CSLI and learning how humans do it, but thanks to the successor thing. Back in the 50s, they used to have signs that no Jews or African Americans, except they didn't use that word, allowed at country clubs. On Judge Scalia's interpretation, they were trying to keep Sammy Davis Jr. out, but nobody else, right? But you wouldn't have been able to get in one of those country clubs if you gone up and said, well, I'm African American, but I'm not Jewish. So my point is, we don't need more people in the world. The world has too many people. We need computers that don't have personal identity. They don't have a psychology governed by their first-person memories and their first-person anticipations and plans. We need data-driven intelligence whose goal is not anything personal, but to help humans not make asses of themselves. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, John. Okay, so next up we've got Pat Langley, who's actually got a little presentation called Human Learning Before Machine Learning. I agree with that in a temporal sense.
Well, yes. Am I turned on? Okay. Yep. Yes, well, I picked this title because, as you could tell from my question to Neil, I'm a bit of a contrarian, so I thought I would turn the title of the symposium on its head. Again, I'm not against the application of AI and machine learning technology throughout society. My only claim, and because I helped found the field back in the 1980s, and I was an early champion of its application. I ran the first workshop on fielded applications of machine learning in 1993, when there already were systems out in industry being used that had been built using machine learning technology. What's really changed, I think, has been the widespread adoption and the increasing emphasis on statistics and big data. And that's really what this talk is about, is that what I think is there's a danger that we are losing sight of many of the key, that the fact that many of the key ideas in AI and machine learning have their origin in theories of human cognition and human learning. There are very few AI people who are aware of that or will even acknowledge it these days. And if you want to build computers that collaborate with people effectively, I would argue that you want the AI systems that adopt human-like representations and human-like knowledge, that follow social norms of interaction and dialogue, and that can do things like reason about the beliefs and goals of the people that they're aiding. And these kinds of tenets are usually associated with a counter-movement within AI called cognitive systems. It's very similar in spirit to a lot of the early AI frameworks, although moving into new problems and trying to go after real-world tasks. It's very different from the recent bandwagons, and it has a long and successful history. There are plenty of examples, including some of the early work in machine learning, which generated as output knowledge bases that people could interpret. So again, I'm not saying that there haven't been genuine successes, particularly in the area of pattern recognition, but if you want to build systems that help people on more complex tasks, and I don't mean recognizing objects in images, but rather generating plans or figuring out how to design a building, then I think that you need something different. So one example comes from conversational assistants, right? So right now, we have, some people have Siri on their phones, but no one's real satisfied with it. But we are close to, we have examples of true conversational assistants that have been around, again, for maybe 20 years. They weren't very mature, but I think we're not too far off from having real, from interacting with computers in speech over extended periods of time. But right now, what we've got basically are chatbots. They're very shallow. They don't really understand meaning. And some things we know about human dialogue is that it usually involves communicative actions that are in support of a goal-directed joint activity. Like take two people who are trying to move a couch together, right? And they have to communicate about it. They're trying to get the couch somewhere, but they're also trying to not bump into the walls or break the couch. And so the dialogue acts are about achieving this goal in ways that people help each other out. To do that, Herb Clark, who's here at Stanford in psychology, has championed the idea that participants in conversations develop a common ground. That's not only that they have similar beliefs and goals about what's going on, but that they know that the other person does too. So they have models of the other agent's mental state. And that much of this is not stated explicitly. It's inferred. It's inferred by what they say and by what they do through some, not deductive reasoning, but more abductive reasoning, where you make informed guesses based on your knowledge. Most of the work on machine learning these days, modern stuff, has lost sight of that. And let me just point out, this is not saying that you can't take machine learning approach to build dialogue systems that have these characteristics. We can. It's just that, in fact, when I worked at Daimler-Benz 20 years ago, we did, but they're not being done now. Another area is autonomous agents, not just self-driving cars, but autonomous weapons on the battlefield, or in other areas. People will not accept them unless those agents can state their reasons for making decisions when they make plans. When they start to execute those plans and decide to do something different, they can explain why they diverged from the plan. They can actually clarify their reasoning in terms of not just the states they're in, but how those states relate to the goals. And when I say goals, I mean something that you can describe, not just some numeric evaluation function, but something that a human would recognize as a goal. And they can talk about their activities at different levels of abstraction and detail. These are all things people can do. And I would argue that before humans really accept autonomous agents that are driven by AI systems, that those AI systems will need to do the same things. Now, there is work on this. There's a DARPA program in this area. But most of it is focused on trying to take deep learning, the results of deep learning, and make them interpretable. And I think that's a legitimate path. But there's the other, to me, more obvious approach is to use more traditional notions from AI embed like AI planning techniques and embed machine learning in them if you want. And then when you're done, you still have something that's inherently explainable. Let me tell you last about my favorite topic, which is what I did my thesis on back at Carnegie Mellon. I've been very interested in the nature of scientific discovery, and I built some of the first systems that discovered scientific knowledge. There are plenty of other examples since then, and some of them have led to publications in the scientific literature. I don't mean the AI literature, I mean the scientific literature, so genuinely new findings that scientists themselves found interesting. And if you look at science, it's distinguished from other endeavors by some key factors. One of them is that models are stated in some formal notation. It's different in different fields, right? In physics, it's equations. In chemistry, it's reaction pathways. In biology, it's often some kind of qualitative causal model. But there are always some scientific notations that scientists use to communicate in their papers, in their talks. Also, background knowledge about the field informs and constrains the discovery process. So if you find some new result that's completely inconsistent with previous stuff, then you've got issues, right? So I had a colleague at Irvine years ago who did data mining, and they were found some very accurate rule for predicting whether someone had Alzheimer's. And one of the conditions was that they were less than 35. And that just wasn't right, right? So they revised the algorithm, and when they were done, it took into account knowledge like, well, you know, Alzheimer's increases with age. You can do that, and you don't have to have radically new algorithms to do this. Often, we only have moderate amounts of data. Daniel mentioned that that's true in medicine, and that really is an issue. Fourth, scientists don't just want descriptions or shallow predictive models. They want explanations of phenomena. And finally, which is not what we're getting out of most AI systems these days. And finally, they don't want to be replaced. They want interactive aids. So there's a lot of work on scientific data mining that's ignored these issues. Work on computational scientific discovery, the kind of work that I and my colleagues have done, has addressed each of them, and we're still doing that. And if you want to find out more, there's a bunch of papers on each of these issues to help you understand more where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, and while we're switching over, there's a little story about Steve Wolfram and his package Mathematica, the computer algebra system. If you use that to solve a problem like an integral, one of the features Mathematica offers you is that you can ask it to show the working so you can understand how it did it. And Steve Wolfram told me once in a conversation, it won't tell you how it did it because it did it using some very sophisticated algorithms. It will tell you the answer it knows you want to know. It'll say it's integration by parts or partial fractions. In other words, it has, in a sense, a built-in model of the human, and it will give you the answer in terms that the human's looking for. It uses a much more sophisticated algorithm. So with that, let's move on to Emily.
And I know we're gonna, is this on? Yeah, I know we're gonna have a conversation at the end, and I'll just say as a preview to that, I disagree with some of the comments Pat just said. I think, I'm not convinced that we need interpretability always. I think that probably most Americans don't understand how their microwave works, but we don't wake up in the morning and think, oh my God, will my microwave kill me? We somehow have trust in physics. We understand, we can generalize their behavior, and I think we're missing that when it's fully data-driven. And so I'm happy to have a longer conversation about that in the questions. I'm super excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about the work that we're doing in my group on human-in-the-loop reinforcement learning, which I think is going to touch on some of the themes, too, that we're already starting to hear about the need for systems that can sort of both combine human and machine learning. So one of the things that I think about a lot is what automation is going to do. I'm certainly not the only one. Any day you look in the news these days, there's almost always an article talking about what is going to be the implications of the sort of AI revolution on the economy. And in particular, there's some really amazing successes, a number of which have been coming out of here from Stanford, on things like self-driving cars, on doing better at diagnostics than people can do. And I think this is a real concern. You know, are we going to replace radiologists? Are we going to replace people that have taken years of training to try to accomplish their jobs? And I think if we do this, we're going to need a way to rapidly reskill and retrain people over time. One of the big focuses in AI has been historically, and John sort of talked about this a little bit before too, of which way we might want to go from this, is AI to automate or replace people. But I'm an optimist, and I prefer to think about AI that amplifies people and how we can use artificial intelligence to train and amplify people to achieve the goals they want to achieve. In particular, who here has seen The Matrix? Right, so in The Matrix, just as a refresher, there is a scene in which Trinity, who is one of the main characters, needs to fly a helicopter. And it's very imperative that she do this, but she doesn't know how. And what she does is she makes a phone call and they download a program into her brain, and about 20 seconds later, she can fly that helicopter. Now, I don't claim that my lab is going to accomplish this in the next 5 years, but I do think it's a really incredible vision of what it would mean for education to be real-time, incredibly effective, and incredibly efficient in a demand-driven way. And so that's really one of the things that inspires me in the work that I do. So how do I think about how we might accomplish this? I think of this in the context of making automated systems that get better and better the more people they teach. So you can imagine you might have a computer that gives a student a math exercise, and that student responds in some way. And then based on that information, a little bit like what John was saying, the machine would then give a different math exercise. Given the information that it got and the history of the things it's done so far, what is the next math exercise it should do? And to do this in an adaptive, personalized way. Well, of course, the key question might be, well, how should it do that? And I would argue it's going to do something like this to try to optimize student outcomes. And again, to go back to John's point, what is that value? There's a lot of really interesting questions, but let's imagine that for a second we just want to pass an exam. So that's going to be the objective. And so the system is going to be trying to give math exercises to the student in order to optimize this objective. And so we want to be able to create these continually improving tutoring systems, which are trying to develop a policy of how to take prior experience or information to what new activity to give in order to maximize student outcomes. But once we write it down in this formula, we can think of this as a sort of more general instance of what's known as reinforcement learning, where we have these systems that are learning how to make decisions in order to optimize some objective. And I am particularly interested in reinforcement learning with a human in the loop, where we might have a system that is interacting with a person. Now, many of you guys might have heard of some really exciting progress recently. Who here has heard of AlphaGo? Okay, a number of people have, not everyone. Just as a quick refresher, we now have AI agents that can play Go better than humans. There's been several different Nature papers coming out about this accomplishment. For those of you that haven't played Go, and it's an extremely hard game to master. It was considered to be something that we wouldn't expect to solve for many years. And the way that we've solved this is in part due to reinforcement learning. Similarly, there's been some really amazing successes on Atari games and having agents that learn to play them automatically. So I think this has been really exciting. This has been things that have been happening over the last few years. But video games and even robots, where we're also seeing a lot of really amazing successes, are not the same as people. And I'll just touch on briefly on a couple of reasons for why that is. Why, if we're doing reinforcement learning to amplify people, it might be different than the techniques we need to solve video games. The first is that if we think of a video game, there's a closed loop system. I can't decide halfway through playing the video game that I want to do a new action that isn't possible. So let's say I want my agent to be able to jump, but maybe my agent can't jump, and I can't suddenly give that capability to the agent. Similarly, I might decide that it would be really helpful if I could know what was in a later room in the video game, but I can't access that. I don't have an ability to create a new sensor. But in contrast to that, in real-world scenarios like medicine that we've heard about or in education, we invent new things. If the Zika virus comes up, we don't just say, well, that's too bad. We don't have anything to deal with the Zika virus. That's really unfortunate. Instead, what we do is we invent a new vaccine. And similarly, if we can't sense things about our universe, we invent things like the Hubble Space Telescope. So these systems are not closed. We're not doomed to failure if we can't succeed immediately. And so we can change these systems over time. And so some of the work that we're doing in my group now is thinking about how do we have humans in many aspects of the reinforcement learning loop so that we could be reaching out to a group of experts or crowd workers to change the system, to do things like add new activities if the ones that we have are not helping people learn, or to create new sensors like trying to understand student affect or motivation if we don't think that we're able to customize and allow people to learn in the way that they want to. So that's one of the key differences compared to sort of video games and robots. Another is that the very way we want to learn is often different in these systems. So if you think of a video game or maybe even a robot, it's often very cheap to try things. So it doesn't really matter if my agent dies 10 million times inside of my video game, as long as when I finally learn, I've learned a successful policy. Similarly, in the case of robotics, we often have pretty good models of how physics works. So we can just think really, really hard in our brain for a long time, and then finally get a good policy that we can use in the real world. In contrast, we don't have very good models of people. It's really hard to model human physiology. It's really hard to model human learning. It's hard to model human behavior. And yet, at the same time, these are very high-stakes systems. We don't want to have systems that fail to teach 1 million people fractions. So we have this sort of hard issue that, on the one hand, we don't have very good models that we could use to simulate. And on the other hand, we don't want to just randomly experiment in the world. So some of the work that we've been doing in this is how do we leverage our old data in order to make better decisions? Because that's one thing we do have. We do have data about people and how they learn, how they make decisions, and also a lot of the information about them in medicine. So let me just tell you a very brief example of something we're thinking about. Imagine that we have some type of classrooms where we give them computer activities and then a chalkboard, and we see how well they do. And we have other classrooms, I'll call these the B classrooms, where we reverse those. We first give them the chalkboard exercise and then the computer, and we see some different score. And the question is, if a new student comes along, what should we do? So this is what's known as sort of off-policy or batch learning. This is what we want to do when we've got old data, and we want to use it not just to make predictions, but actually to make better decisions in the future. Now, this is a question that comes up in many different domains outside of education. It certainly comes up in medicine, where we have different strategies of treating people and maybe even different interventions, and we want to learn good strategies and good policies for treating people in the future. So why is this a hard problem? Well, it's a hard problem because of what's known as counterfactual reasoning. The fact that I didn't tell you what would happen in B classrooms if we were to do a computer and then a chalkboard. It might be that A classrooms are kindergartners and B classrooms are college students, and so there's no reason to be able to expect that we could compare between these two. In fact, Judea Pearl argues that our ability to do a counterfactual reasoning is a critical aspect of intelligence. We can imagine what would happen for things that we've never tried before. So we thought about this in the context of education, where we had a video game, and we wanted to figure out how to better teach people and engage them in this. So in particular, we had access to about 11,000 students' prior data, and we wanted to figure out a strategy for what game level to give when in order to keep engagement high. And using some new techniques in reinforcement learning and statistics, we managed to identify a policy that led to 30% higher engagement, which we then verified in a study with 2,000 additional students. So the interesting thing here is that we're using old data to hypothesize what it would be like to do something in the future before we tried it. And then we showed that those estimates were reliable and in fact did lead to the improvement we expected. So just to summarize, in my group, I'm really excited about how we can think about using these machine learning systems to amplify human potential. And I think it introduces a lot of new technical challenges that are relevant both to education, but also to many other cases where we're interacting with people. I just want to briefly thank my lab that does most of this work. And I look forward to the later discussion.
Okay, thank you, Emma. And that was one of my favorite math video games you just showed the screen for, in fraction. John?
I'm an outsider here. I'm a school teacher by training. In fact, let me come out. A school teacher by training and an educator. And when I heard that machine learning was the up-and-coming thing 30 or 40 years ago, Pat, I took an interest in it. And it has risen since then. And since I'm in a school of education, it was kind of a turf situation. Hey, learning's my thing. And now, in fact, one of the big results is that we now have a thing called human learning, where once we just had learning complete. It's going through the courts right now. It's a trademark thing that we're going to try to settle. But at any rate, it's a serious consequence for me, and I want to consider the consequences of being relegated now to a form of human learning. Still in the loop, but something that we once had a complete monopoly on. I want to situate my talk across 2 points here. The first, in terms of machine learning, is this correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions. Is anyone familiar with this? I hope not. But if you've been to court recently and have been sentenced, this may have come up. This is an artificial intelligence system that helps the judge make a decision about how long your sentence should be based on prior activity. It has been challenged. The Supreme Court actually just turned down an opportunity to hear it, but Loomis versus Wisconsin is the case in which the appeal was made that it was an unfair sentencing. The decision that was made was, in fact, that the defendant did not have access to the algorithm that determined their sentence. It was as if something secretive and not so transparent had taken place, as if the blindfold of justice had gone across both the defendant and his lawyers. eyes. But in fact, the judges, in the first appeal, the judges said no, because the judges do not have access to the proprietary algorithm either. You're totally satisfied with that? That's a very comforting thought. Compass, a company called Compass, is the proprietary holder of that software, and properly or improperly defended themselves on those grounds. That's on one pole. I'm not going there, I'm going between there. The other side of my pole is the philosopher's problem, John. The philosopher's problem had been in the past a question of what is intelligence? Do we have humanity? Are we, the message that is coming across from under the door, the slip under the door, does it indicate there's intelligence on the other side of the room? And that's the Turing test. But Leibniz, centuries before, had a mill in which he imagined that there was a machine that could perceive the world. And if you went into that mill, all you would see is levers and gears and all made of wood. And where would that intelligence be? And so that question has been with us. John Searle's The Chinese Room argument, another aspect of this in which again, the slips of paper, always a lovely primitive notion of paper, but the slips of paper indicate that someone in the room knows Chinese, only no one does know Chinese in the room. They're following a series of rules. And the idea of understanding is a critical part for me. Because I want to suggest to you that machine learning is not going to increase our understanding. My worry is it's going to decrease our understanding because it requires less understanding. That the deep neural machine learning models today, based on our brains, are more effective, need less training and less human programming to produce more efficient results, and giving us, in effect, less knowledge about what is being learned. I want to suggest that the collaboration that's the theme of this conference is more like parallel play. That is, Daniel's model in radiology was that the system would be able to work with the doctor, but there were parts that the system could do better and there are parts the doctor could intervene in, but that's what we call in kindergarten parallel play. The machine is not saying to the doctor, look at how this process happens, look at how this analysis should take place in this sequence over this framework in order to arrive at this. You've been missing an element. No. The machine learning says, I can create a more precise pattern match at a much higher percentage precision than you're able to. Who are you going to listen to? Now, in the doctor's office, I would go with a higher percentage in every instance. But as someone interested in the future of learning, let me qualify that. Someone interested in the future of human learning, I want to ask you, those of you working in machine learning, to think about how we might begin to build in another kind of feedback loop that doesn't just include the human, but that informs, that educates, that pauses and stops. Because otherwise we're reinforcing a notion of learning as what we call in school, drill and kill. A form of learning that I have worked my entire career as an educator to not eliminate, but to diminish against notions of understanding, imagination, creativity as part of what it means to learn. And my fear is that the triumph of machine learning is going to be the triumph of training, not education, not learning. And we talk about in education that teaching is learning twice, but my fear is that machine learning is going to be a form of learning without teaching and no increase, a comparable increase in knowledge. So if I could have, I need to push the button. This is how I get educated, at least. Let's see here. My bicycle in San Francisco, I see this and I say to myself, where is machine learning today that on the billboards of this town, they're posing these kinds of dilemmas? And really, it's the future of education, because do you know what Cloudflower is? It should have been crowd power, but that was already taken. Cloudflower is where you log in and analyze cat videos as cat or dog. Cloudflower is where you can step in to establish that the training data that you can analyze and label at Mechanical Turk level pay rates will be the future of the algorithms that drive our world. And the extent to which machine learning becomes the source of direction for the human experience has got to be a concern for us. If this is what I'm to prepare, and starting with Jane Goodall's grandchildren, great-grandchildren, Neil, I was very touching at the beginning there. I'm responsible for the education of those great-grandchildren. It takes that long for us to have any impact, generations. And I want to think about then what are our responsibilities in terms of machine learning, because it surely isn't to turn the entire world into machine learning specialists, because that is so contrary to the notion of machine learning. That is, the better the machine learning is, the fewer programmers we need, the less programming we require. But what we need is better and better data. And the relationship between data and learning, for me, is the question. How can we build into that equation between machine learning data, training data, and machine learning an aspect of knowledge extraction? Thank you very much.
So let me try to fire up the panel with a question which I'll direct at John. So John, and there are enough people with grey hair in the room that this makes a lot of sense. If Hubert Dreyfus were around and wanted to revise his book, What Computers Can't Do, what kind of changes would he need to make, if any? You remember the book, of course.
Yeah, I remember the book. I remember Hubert.
Yeah.
Alas.
Yes, alas. I think you were asking this, John.
Do you want to answer that one, or jump in?
I don't see why he would change much. I mean,
Hubert was very much about the presumption of AI, the overclaiming.
Yeah.
He was not about its impossibility. He was about the way in which it was making a claim on intelligence that it had no right to make. Yeah. And it was much more a conditional algorithm level of AI, much more a sense of presumption. And so the philosopher's role, as you did earlier, is to humble us and to bring within range what it is we are doing. And I think actually the speakers today, I was very impressed with the humility, the qualification that was introduced at each point by Daniel and Jacob. No, Daniel and Neil, excuse me.
Yeah, I just don't remember Hubert's book that well, but yeah, I imagine it's pretty dated.
do you really think that his arguments would have to change in any fundamental way, though?
Maybe for the audience, it would be helpful to remind them what the main arguments are.
For me to read it, he'd have to not appeal to Heidegger.
I have not read the book. You probably haven't read the book because you talked with him so much, so you didn't have to. But you know what he felt.
Well, I don't know whether I read the book or just read the thing on the jacket. So back in the days of bookstores, you could get by. You know, you go down to the bookstore. Yeah. I had to introduce Michel Foucault once at Memod because Ian Hacking turned out not to be available. So with 2 days warning, I went down to the bookstore and read all the blurbs on the jacket. I gave him an introduction. He says, the best introduction he ever had. So that's a completely irrelevant response to your question.
It was a starter question to just get the conversation going.
Well, but I think there is, within the AI community, even people who are wildly enthusiastic about the new results of machine learning are concerned about the hype. Because we saw this before, back in the expert systems craze in the 1980s, which grew out of Stanford. And expert systems, if you haven't heard about them, was you would build knowledge bases for doing complex tasks. You'd build them by hand, by interview experts. You would try and codify that knowledge. And these were very successful. They were used in industry. Early machine learning was actually a response to the expert systems movement, trying to automate the acquisition of knowledge. And that it was, but it was hyped. And there was ultimately a backlash. People said, well, nah, you're not doing everything you said, and it only went so far. And for quite a while there, AI had a bad name, and this could happen again. So in that sense, I think there is a real danger for the community, and it would not hurt for us to step back a little bit and maybe try and say, well, we're doing great things, but let's not say that we're doing more than we are.
Just to quick question. In fact, I had an interesting discussion with Doug Lynette the other day, who I trace back to the same enthusiasm that gave rise to CSLI. Mm-hmm. But he's doing great down there in Austin. Is he still pursuing the same picture that we had, or has he adjusted his goals?
I have not talked with him in a few years, but he's certainly, I believe, still a champion of knowledge-based approaches to AI, where you represent knowledge explicitly. I do know that they are incorporating some machine learning techniques in their work, but it's more in a supportive role, not trying to replace all the knowledge.
Okay.
I would argue, though, that there's already a lot of awareness of this in the AI community. So certainly, with response to the recent election and what's been happening at Facebook and Google, et cetera, there's a lot of awareness of both the fact that if these are purely data-driven, they're going to reflect the biases of our society. And in fact, there may be opportunities for machine learning to automatically remove some of the biases of our society. I think that also there's a lot of awareness of how these can be gamed and thinking of game theory and other approaches. And finally, certainly because of the emphasis in the European Union for things to be explainable, there's a lot of immediate interest in how to make them interpretable and explainable. I certainly agree with John's point that we don't want to end up where we are just simply labeling data for machines. I don't think that would be what we want out of intelligence. And I think the real goal is to end up with systems that can do things that neither can alone, and that doesn't mean parallel plane, that means deep integrative collaboration. But I do think that the role of people and machines are going to change drastically over the next 20 or 30 years because of some of the things that we're seeing are now possible, that will allow people to do different types of work. And I think as an example of some work that gets to more deeper understanding that I think is really exciting, there's some work coming out of Daphne Shahaf and Nikki Couture's group recently on trying to understand analogies in a really deep way. So that how could we understand, say, uncorking a bottle as being something that might allow us insight for new devices for difficult childbirth. That's a really deep analogy to try to understand. And if we could have machines that can try to learn about that sort of analogy from literature, it could help advance and be tools for scientific discovery. And there's a recent paper about that. So I think that certainly given the amount of knowledge that's coming out, we could use machines to try to help us do this sort of creative, much more deep thinking way that we don't yet have machines able to do.
I think that's good. That's good work. But there has been work on analogy for 20 years, and some of it's doing this kind of deep stuff. So I'm glad that Lisa's been working on that. But it's the same thing. It's like it's not that these are bad ideas. It's that I don't. So in 1997, you mentioned the DeepMind success on Go, right? In 1997, Jerry Tesoro had a wonderful result on using reinforcement learning to build backgammon player, right? And so it blew people away at the time. So have we come up since then? Yes. Are we now? For a long time we've been able to get AI systems to do things that as good as people or better than people. And by the way, I did not say that we always needed to explain things. I think that for things like pattern recognition, like object recognition in images, I don't think that's nearly as important as explaining things when it comes to, say, an agent that's doing a complex activity over a long period of time. So I think you may have misinterpreted what I said.
Oh, I was just trying to indicate that I think there's some cases where interpretability is good and other cases where it's really about trust.
I agree.
And trust may not require interpretation.
And I also wanted to say so I have a colleague in educational psychology. No, you?
Oh, me.
Yeah, sorry. Stefan Olson at the University of Illinois Chicago a few years ago published a book called Deep Learning. It was about how humans learn in the educational system, learn really deep knowledge, conceptual things, principles, things like this. So he published it just about the time when Jeff Hinton was going around really pushing on his deep learning stuff. And Hinton, according to Stellan, sent him emails saying, basically, you really shouldn't be using this term. It's a reserved term. We own it. I thought you would appreciate that.
Yes.
Because the kind of deep that we're talking about with humans is very different from the kind of deep that has come to be popular in the AI community.
But the idea of extracting from the deep learning of machines some aspect of the process, some way of not just the efficiency of the outcomes, but tapping in at various points.
But my position would be that, again, a lot of the early ideas in AI and machine learning came out of studies of human cognition and learning, and they are already doing this. And you can put machine learning in there. The central insight that led to AI back in the late 50s was that computers are not just mere number crunchers. They are general symbol processors. So if you want to have them operate over logic or scientific notations or anything you want, you can do it. You can define a space of possibilities. They can search that. It can be guided by data, but it can also be guided by background knowledge. It can also be guided by humans. And that idea almost seems to have been forgotten in the gold rush toward this new way of doing things. And it's not that these techniques are bad, but I'm worried about throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Okay, I've just been signaled that we're out of time by the boss. So, and she is the boss here today, so let's finish by thanking the panel for the discussion.
Thank you.